Welcome to the Green Room, where we explore the environmental issues that green up our world. COP24 stands for the 24th Conference of the Parties to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. Our guest today is Marlotte DeJong, one of the 9 University of Michigan students who attended COP24 last December in Poland. She's here to talk with us about the COP and also about climate change-induced migration, one of her areas of expertise. Marlotte, welcome to the show.
Hi, Barbara. Thanks for having me.
So we'll give just a little background. You have a master's degree, or you're working right now on your master's degree in environmental policy, planning, and environmental justice, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and so you got to go to the COP, which is really awesome. You were there for what, a week or something?
Yes, 1 week.
So what is that COP exactly?
Yeah, so the COP, which stands for the Conference of the Parties, is essentially sort of the main sort of governing body of the UNFCCC, which is the United Nations sort of organization that works on climate change. And essentially what that means is that every year or so, all of the countries who sign on as parties to the UNFCCC, so they're agreeing to be part of the dialogue on climate change, get together to sort of talk about the pressing issues facing the international community as it relates to climate change, as well as trying to come up with sort of policies and guidelines with which to sort of implement action on it.
Big job. And you guys were there as observers,
Yes.
but you tell me that was kind of hard because a lot of things were, what, closed door?
Exactly, yeah. So observers, which are typically sort of academics or sort of NGOs or different stakeholders, but are not representing countries, are allowed to come to the COP to sort of sit in on the negotiations. They're not allowed to participate directly, but they are able to watch the negotiations happen. And this is really designed to increase the transparency of the COP and kind of increase the visibility of what goes on at the COP to sort of the rest of the world. But we did kind of run into a lot of issues. Of course, it makes sense why certain meetings are closed door, things where the heads of states are there. Of course, for security reasons, observers can't be attending, as well as strategy meetings we're not allowed in. But theoretically, observers should be allowed to go to all of the other negotiations. However, at Katowice, the most recent COP in Poland, we found that wasn't necessarily always the case. Oftentimes, events, negotiations that would be listed as open on the website, you would show up and all of a sudden they would be closed door meetings. Or they would be at capacity, and then you would find out later from people in the room that actually they were completely empty and there was no reason that people wouldn't be allowed to be in. So that certainly calls into question some of that transparency. And I know a lot of observers were sort of thinking, like, how transparent are the process really? And to what degree are observers actually allowed to be sort of part of the dialogue?
And it would be important for the data on emissions and mitigations that everybody, sees what's going on. So,
Absolutely.
So justice issues, that's one of your specialties. And in relation to the consensus requirement, how does that relate?
Yeah, absolutely. So essentially any decision that's made at the COP has to be by consensus. And what that means is that every single 197 parties has to agree to not only just the kind of broader idea that's being put forth, but the actual language with which it's being conveyed. And so that's really designed to try to bring in some of this equity in the sense that no country has a louder voice than another one. So the United States has just as much say in the process as Vanuatu, a smaller island nation. But of course, that sort of does call into question certain elements about efficiency, because to get 197 countries to agree on something is very challenging. And when you have an issue like climate change that really necessitates urgent action, when you have to wait for someone to agree, for everyone to agree, and everyone to agree on a specific language, that can get really tricky. And so a lot of people are worried that trying to have this consensus might actually be hindering, making it more difficult for sort of long-run action.
One of the things you said that there's difficulty getting consensus about is this idea of common but differentiated responsibilities. What's that?
So common but differentiated responsibilities was put into place during the Paris Agreement. And essentially what that means is that while everyone, every country, every community, every individual has a responsibility to act on climate change, a country's historic contribution to the problem, as well as their relative capability to act upon it. So whether that's the technology that they have, the financial capacity that they have to act on it, actually like human capital people to be able to work on the issue, that should all also determine the degree to which they're supposed to act. And this is primarily being driven by a lot of sort of developing countries who are saying that, well, developed countries like the United States are responsible for far more of the carbon emissions. They have the financial capacity to be able to do more. They have the technology to do it. It should be more their responsibility to not only take action on it, but to help us, these countries that maybe haven't contributed as much but are feeling the effects more, who don't have the same level of capacity. They need to be helping us more. And of course, this is being pushed against by these developed nations who don't want more of the burden of the responsibility, who want it to be that everybody has an equal stake, an equal, needs to have an equal contribution to it.
Did you see any progress on that while you were there?
Not a ton, at least in the week that we were there. I think that they ultimately decided not to have two separate rule books, which was the idea that, you know, certain countries were putting forth that developed countries would have one rule book that they would be held to, and developing countries would have another. And the United States and many other kind of developed countries were really against that. They wanted to just have one rule book, and they ultimately came up with just one, but it's very flexible to kind of allow some developing nations to still have some flexibility. So it was kind of seen as that compromise. So it was a little bit in between, I would say.
Another concept you mentioned was just transitions. What's that?
So just transitions refers to this idea that you have countries and communities who not only just their economies are really based around fossil fuels, but their identities as well. I think a great example is Katowice, where the COP was, which is the heart of Polish coal country. And not only is their kind of economy both historically as well as sort of currently really dominated by coal, but they're proud coal miners, and that's really what they hold very strongly with their identity. And so the idea of just transitions comes in is that it's very difficult to kind of come in as outsiders and say, tomorrow you need to totally get rid of coal, because that's not really fair and just for this community. It's going to take time. And so the idea of just transitions is to kind of, how do we help countries and help communities move away from fossil fuel in a way that's not sort of forcing them to do something overnight, that gives them time to adapt and gives them time to adjust, and do that in sort of an ethical and a just manner. And that's really was at the forefront of the conversation in Poland about how do we help Poland, for example, move away from coal in a way that's just for these communities as well.
Yeah, it reminds me of the tobacco money was spent on helping tobacco farmers to get into other crops so they could stay farming. So that's important. And I've also heard that with the coal miners, instead of saying to them, hey, you need to go, you know, learn how to install solar panels, you know, tell them you can retrain in whatever you want, whatever's important to you, but we're going to help you retrain.
Absolutely, and I think that's sort of the central thing, is that process isn't going to happen overnight, and it's going to take sort of people helping with that process and kind of giving people the capacity and the resources to do that. That's not just coming in and being like, change what you're doing by tomorrow, or we're going to slap a bunch of fines on you.
So let's talk now about this concept of climate change-induced migration. I came across a quote that really resonated with me. It's, the United Nations says, climate change is fundamentally redrawing the map of where people can live. Granted, not all problems in our world are caused by human-induced climate change, but one thing you mentioned to me earlier is that climate change is a threat magnifier. So can you give us some examples of how this threat magnifier is causing outward migration from different countries? Absolutely.
So there's sort of a number of different ways, and it's important to also understand that climate migration can be caused by these really sudden, like sudden onset issues, things like increased frequency and intensity of storms, or rising, you know, having really severe droughts. But it can also be sort of a gradual process of gradually rising sea levels, gradual desertification, where sort of communities can no longer grow their traditional crops, things like that. And we see it sort of happening in a number of places. So small island developing states are the most vulnerable to rising sea levels, to storm surges. I think the most recent statistic I saw is that some of these island nations, Kiribati and Tuvalu, have lost 6 islands in the last year each.
Really?
And of course, you know, right now
people were living on those islands.
And right now those people are just moving sort of centrally to different islands, but it begs a logical question of at what point, do these people no longer have an option to stay in their sort of home countries and they will be forced to have to move away. So a lot of these island nations are the most sort of concrete examples where you see it happening, but the United States is absolutely not immune to the problem. So there's a number of examples. Alaska, for example, I think has had 8 or 9 communities sort of voting to relocate inland because they have so much melting permafrost that their villages are set to crumble into the sea. There was a community, and I'll probably butcher the name, but the Île de Jean-Charles community in Louisiana voted to relocate. They relocated in 2015, and it was a $48.3 million project by the United States to move them. A lot of people also say that these recent forest fires in California, highly linked to climate change, in 2018 alone, that cost like $3 billion in damage and displaced 50,000 people.
Wow.
So all of these things, you see it happening across the globe, across the world, in the United States, in other countries, and it's really becoming a really pressing global issue that's requiring really urgent action.
Yeah, I was reading drought in Somalia, heat waves in Iraq, flooding in Bangladesh. You told me before about mudslides in Central America. Another thing you mentioned earlier, which I thought was really interesting, was you said, how can you put a price on culture? When people have to leave, like say these island nations all have to move to, I don't know where they would go, but they've got the problem of moving. And yes, there might be housing provided to them, but are they going to maintain that culture, or is that culture going to die?
Absolutely, and that was something that came up. There was a number of side events at the most recent COP that was around this question of displacement. And they brought in a speaker from Tuvalu, from one of these island nations, who was saying exactly this. They were like, the way that people are talking about displacement at the COP is around sort of loss and damage, right? How do we put a price tag to compensate people for the lost homes, for their lost income from the crops that they would traditionally grow? But how do you put a price tag on someone's language, on someone's identity, someone's culture? Because those are all things that are also at stake of being lost. And of course, countries don't want to have to confront this idea of how do you put a price tag on something that's priceless. But that's certainly something that's likely will be something that needs to be confronted by countries.
Speaking of language, you mentioned that the wording, like, should they be called refugees?
Yeah, so that's probably one of the biggest issues. So the first thing within that is what people call people who are displaced by climate change can vary substantially. So it's from climate migrants to climate refugees to environmental migrants to environmentally displaced people. I think there's probably 10s or 20s of different terms used to describe the same group of people, which again begs a logical question of how do you have action on something if you can't even define and put one concrete word on what it is? So that's one huge issue. And then the second issue that you mentioned around refugees is that a lot of countries are pushing back against the use of the term refugees for people who have been displaced by climate-related effects. And the reason for that is because of the legal obligation that countries have when there's the term refugee being used. So any countries that signed on to the Geneva Convention or to this Global Compact on Refugee, they've committed themselves legally to defending refugees, to doing something about a refugee problem. Well, if we don't call them refugees, we don't have to do anything about it. And so that's often what the thinking is that these countries don't want to have an obligation to do something because there are hundreds of millions of people at risk for displacement. So they don't want to have that legal obligation to do anything about it. So if we don't call them refugees, we don't have to do something, is unfortunately the way that it's being thought about. So that gets really tough then, is, we need to put a word on the issue, but we're getting pushback for what that word would be. Right now, a lot of this movement is internal. A lot of it is going from rural areas to cities, but we're already seeing quite a lot of cross-border migration, and it's only going to get worse, especially when we think of that entire countries are at risk for being sort of underwater. Bangladesh is a great example. I think some estimates say that within 20, 50 years, Bangladesh as a country will be completely underwater. So all of those millions of people will be forced to go to different countries. Well, if everyone's borders are closed, where are people going to go? So it's really a challenging issue, and it's concerning. It makes me nervous of sort of this is a growing humanitarian crisis, and we need to have some sort of action on it, but it's how do you hold these countries accountable to do something?
Do you think there's a lot of people that are studying it and
It's getting there. I think it's still kind of this like niche field. I think it's still quite new. I think this connection between the ways that climate change and migration can intersect is a really new idea in the last 10-ish years. I do think that there's a number of people that are working on it. The International Organization for Migration just came up with like a full unit that's dedicated to looking at this specific issue, and they're really pushing for action. So I think that there are people working on it, but there should be more. I think this is an issue that's severely underfunded and severely under-researched. But I think most recently the GAO, the Government Accountability Office of the United States government issued a report saying that the Department of Defense needs to be looking at this. And I think that report came out like a week ago. So hopefully,
security issue.
Yeah, fingers crossed that means that there'll be more funding, there'll be more people looking at it, which means more hope for that something is going to get done.
Yeah, I have heard that the Department of Defense in the U.S. is fully in support of climate change solutions.
Yes, yeah.
Because it really is a security issue. So if people want to learn more about climate change-induced migration, what do you suggest?
I mean, I think, at the risk of sounding too sort of basic, I think a Google search is always a great place to start. The UNFCCC website has a lot of really great resources, as well as the IOM, the International Organization for Migration. If specifically looking at sort of climate justice and justice-related issues, the Climate Justice Alliance has a really great website with a lot of good information. So I would certainly start there.
Okay, great. Well, this has been super interesting, and I really appreciate you coming today to talk about it.
Thank you so much for having me. I really enjoyed it.
For an online archive of all our Green Room shows, visit washtenaw.org/greenroom. Thanks for joining us here in the Green Room.